Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. When I was a kid, we lived in Northwest Iowa for just a little while. This is right at the beginning of my memories. But the house we lived in was a parsonage. My dad was a pastor, and so there was an acreage. It was a country church. And on that acreage, you had a whole bunch of lawn, and you also had a church, and then you also had a big white house, a 2-story white house surrounded by farmland, cornfields all around on every side. And I remember a lot about it, even though it's been a while now. And one of my memories is a little garden, I think, that my mom had out in the back. I saw a snake there, my first garden snake kind of thing. I remember freaking me out and calling my dad to come and do something about it. And when I went back last time, which has been a few years ago, I took my kids and we went to find this place out in the country. We pulled up and the house I said was there wasn't there anymore. It's gone. They bulldozed it. I don't know, financial concerns or something was wrong with the foundation. I have no idea what the deal was, but it's gone. And the land was pretty transformed as well. And so I couldn't find the garden. And I was like, that's where I saw my first snake. I wanted to show you the garden. One of my earliest memories is right there because I saw that snake. And it just occurred to me that planet Earth reclaims certainty about our physical location memories very, very quickly. It was not that long ago that I was a kid there. I mean, yeah, time goes fast. And yeah, we're all aging fast. But into the grand scheme of everything, I was just a kid in that garden wearing little trousers that my mom sewed for me to save us money and seeing my first snake back there. It's not that long ago that my parents were young and energetic and hustling all over the place trying to keep up with 3 kids. But you bulldoze a thing, you move a little bit of dirt around, and then all you got left to do is to try to triangulate with pictures and memories to figure out where it is. And we have tons of data and still can't easily and obviously reestablish where that little garden was in the backyard that I remember from when I was a kid. Likewise, it should be no surprise that trying to find a garden that dates back to 2,000 years ago, as mentioned briefly in Matthew chapter 26, is going to be pretty difficult as well. We've got a place name that is a little bit of a mystery, a soft mystery, and that is Gethsemane. So in Matthew chapter 26, we get the Last Supper, and then they leave the Last Supper, they sing a hymn, it says in Matthew 26, verse 30, and then they're off on their way to the Mount of Olives. Well, we kind of have a sense of where that is in relationship to Old Town, the old city of Jerusalem. But what we don't know is exactly where they went on the Mount of Olives because time has passed and it gets a little bit hazy. Now, whenever we talk about stuff like this, what I find is there are inevitably emails or comments or thoughts that pop up from people who are like, oh, no, wait, I took a trip to Jerusalem one time with my church and the Garden of Gethsemane, it's right there and it's labeled and they know where it is for sure. Well, not really. That's a pretty common thing to go and find things in and around Jerusalem. There's a lot of layers of history there, and there are a lot of different types of certainty about exactly where this thing happened or exactly where that thing happened. It's not as precise a science on most of these locations as pilgrims will be led to believe, and as pilgrims have been led to believe over the centuries, because you don't quite get the experience and you're not quite as willing to part ways with your money for a place that might have been possibly a thing, could have been sort of near here. Many people who take you to places when you're traveling to pilgrimage sites are going to feel very incentivized to speak with superlatives and certainty about these things. The reality is that this place where Jesus and the disciples go as they are having a chit-chat on the way about how everyone's going to abandon Jesus is not 100% nailed down. And yes, I've been there and poked around the area as well myself. So in verse 36, it says, "Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.'" Now, I believe that what we know with certainty about this location is pretty much just common knowledge. I am straight up Googling it as we speak. All right, Wikipedia. What do we got? Gethsemane is a garden at the foot of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. That's what all the notes in all my different Bibles and stuff say as well, that Well, it says at the foot. Some people think it might have been up a ways on the Mount of Olives, but okay. According to the four Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus underwent the agony in the garden and was arrested before his crucifixion there. It's a place of great resonance in Christianity, and there are several small olive trees and church property all adjacent to each other and identified with biblical Gethsemane. This is true. Over the years, there have been a lot of layers of churches and shrines that have cropped up around this area, and there are some super, super old olive trees in this area that are definitely verified, but super old, like among the oldest olive trees in the history of ever, still only takes us back to the beginning of the last millennium, maybe just a little bit earlier. I think like the 1090s are supposed to be, surely they say that here, right? Scrolling the article. About the olive trees, there we go. Dates of AD 1092, 1166, and 1198 were obtained by carbon dating from older parts of the trunks of these trees. So that is incredible. But again, the presence of olive trees dating back to 1,000 years into the history of Christianity doesn't confirm beyond the shadow of a doubt that there were olive trees there dating all the way back to the time of Christ. If people associated a site with that, they would have grown olive trees there in keeping with the name. Oh, have we talked about the name? We didn't talk about the name, did we? Gethsemane, I'm told, more or less just means oil press, and that's why there's the association with the olive trees, because olive oil would be the kind of oil that was being pressed there. So what do we know for sure about this place? Well, the name is telling the truth at all, and you would assume it was. Like if you went to some place called Granite Quarry Road, you would assume that there is or was a granite quarry at or at the end of that road. So it's safe to assume that someplace that is called Gethsemane, and that in a place that is in demand in terms of land as much as Jerusalem and the surrounding area was in the first century, you would assume that that wouldn't have changed. It would still be being used for that purpose, or it would have been renamed. So yeah, it was probably some kind of olive grove, and there was probably some kind of operation there that was not being conducted at this time, given the religious holiday. So it's a little more chill than it might otherwise be. A nice place to go and be quiet in this little garden grove area. I've heard people say, but I don't know enough about horticulture to know for sure, that it would make more sense for this to be a place that would sit at the bottom of the little rise of the Mount of Olives. I don't know. I guess it depends on where you count the beginning of the Mount of Olives being, as to whether you read the text as saying that it was up on top of the hill somehow, or somehow sitting right at the beginning of the rise. I just don't know. The traditional location of the Garden of Gethsemane puts it a little bit more at the foot of a rise. But another thing that we know for sure is that the Garden of Gethsemane has been associated with something in that particular area, close to where it's currently imagined to be if you go and visit. It's been associated with that area for a very, very, very long time. And a lot of times when we're trying to figure out details about the New Testament, we're depending on tradition. Like, well, somebody built a shrine here in 450 AD, and it looks like it was built over the top of something that was probably another shrine, given the shape, that probably dates to somewhere in the early 300s. So therefore, we would guess that Christians around 300 AD believed that this place was the site of, whatever thing we're talking about in this hypothetical example. This gets interesting here, though, because it intersects us with a really interesting piece of history about the Bible and the evolution of these pilgrimage sites in the classical world. Well, the earliest pilgrimage record we've got dates to the early 300s. And it's a fascinating piece of literature. We'll tell you more about that in just a minute. But, that puts us about as far removed from Jesus as you and I are removed from the founding of the United States. So, that gives you a time frame. Is there a lot still physically around from the founding of the United States? There's a pretty decent connection. We got a decent sense of where everything was, because we're relatively close historically, and because people are interested in the history of the United States. So a lot of that has been preserved. Likewise here, give or take 300-ish years after the fact, there would still be something to go and see. And indeed, this report from someone who we know only as the Bordeaux Pilgrim, because he started his journey in Bordeaux in France, and then gave these intricate details about each stop, each changeover, maybe presumably for horses or supplies along the way. We know exactly how this person made their way all the way from France to Jerusalem. We know how many miles it was between each stop. It's such an interesting itinerary to read through. Most of it is just raw data. 8 miles from here to here, 11 miles from here to here. But when he actually gets to Jerusalem, we get a ton more details about what was still there in roughly, 330-ish AD. And what we find is that a lot of stuff was still very visible from New Testament times in the early 300s. The pools of Siloam and Bethsaida were apparently very visible. Elements of the temple or foundations of the temple or something marking where parts of the temple that had been destroyed are still visible. In 330 AD, there's still marks of the high imperial era of Rome, statues to Hadrian that were present that are no longer there. The house of Caiaphas, the high priest, was still visible at this time in some way. Parts of David's palace, the praetorium where Pontius Pilate tried Jesus. This particular pilgrim thought that he knew exactly where Golgotha was, where Jesus was crucified. And then it says about a stone's throw from there is the crypt where Jesus' body was buried. And all of this is stuff that people have used through the years to try to cobble together a sense of where everything is and to reconcile tradition with actual real locations. But then this is the passage that's relevant from this ancient itinerary, the Bordeaux Pilgrims itinerary, that is relevant to our conversation about Gethsemane. Again, quote, going along to Jerusalem to the gate, which is toward the east, as you go up onto the Mount of Olives, there is a valley which is called Jehoshaphat. On the left-hand side where there are vines, and there is also a rock where Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, but on the right-hand side, there's a palm tree whose branches children carried and laid down when Christ was coming. And then it talks about some other stuff, and then it says, from there you go up into the Mount of Olives where the Lord taught his apostles before his passion. There a basilica was made on Constantine's command. But then we see some problems with the account of the Bordeaux pilgrim who has the Mount of Transfiguration being right next to the Mount of Olives. I don't think so. That doesn't square with the text very well. We see him talking about the little village of Bethany where Lazarus was raised. Yeah, that could be. Then he goes down to Jericho from there, and he sees the sycamore tree that is, well, it very well could have still been alive, that Zacchaeus climbed when Jesus went through Jericho. At any rate, it's a fascinating read. I thought you'd enjoy me skimming through a little bit of that with you. And it gives us a little bit of insight into the historical tradition surrounding the location of Gethsemane. It makes it maybe a little more possible to go there yourself and imagine like, oh, okay, there's like an 80% chance that I'm standing where that stuff happened. And I suppose most of all, I felt like this little geographical detour gives you and I an excuse to consider for a moment the challenges that come with trying to piece together, like a modern historian, every single detail of what we encounter in Matthew. In the same way, I can't even go back and find the garden at the house where I saw that snake in Iowa when I was a little kid. So it becomes very, very difficult to go back and with 100% precision cobble together all of these precise historical locations and details. But it is possible to at least get real close and deal in percentage certainty kind of factors, as opposed to we know beyond the shadow of a doubt, even when we don't know beyond the shadow of a doubt. All right, that was fun. I like these kind of little detours. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.